about climate justice. The term climate justice evolved from the concept of environmental justice, emerging in the discourse in the 1980s. Environmental justice conceptualized the unjust disposal of toxic waste in predominantly Black American areas in the United States. The aim of the movement was to rethink environmental issues as social issues by ensuring that ethnic minorities and low economic sectors of the population were not disproportionately affected by adverse environmental impacts or hazards. This was done by applying principles of social justice and human rights, such as every individual has dignity, the elimination of inequity, establishing environments that are supportive of all people. In time, the environmental justice movement moved beyond the toxic waste to include the impact of climate change, giving rise to what we know today as climate justice. Climate justice considers the way in which the climate crisis disproportionately impacts marginalized community. Climate justice is a human-centered approach to climate activism that takes into consideration the common factor that ties the climate movement to other worldwide movements such as workers' rights, racial justice, gender equality, indigenous sovereignty, and many more. 3 easy ways to break down the discourse on climate justice. 1. Recognizing that at the global level, those who are the least responsible for climate change suffer its gravest consequences. 2. At the community level, marginalized groups are typically the most exposed and vulnerable to the effect of climate change. 3. The generation level. The idea that present generation have certain duty towards future generation, framing the refusal of young people today to allow for more inaction from people in power. Now, think about some inequalities and injustice that you are aware of in your life, your community, the global community. Think how these inequalities will be exacerbated by climate change. Whatever reason you come up with is exactly why climate action is not enough. We must demand equitable, fair, inclusive solution to the climate crisis. And that is what climate justice is all about.
Good afternoon and happy Friday. I'm Laura Burris and I'm chair of the biology department at San Francisco State University. We're here today to talk about an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore would say, or an uncomfortable truth, as I would say. And it's deeply uncomfortable because I, even as a scientist, haven't felt like I really know what to do and how to be part of the solution instead of the part of the climate change problem. For the last 1.5 years, we've been in a long, dark pandemic tunnel. Even though we now can see the light at the end of the tunnel, we know that when we went into that tunnel, we had climate change, and we also know that when we come out of that tunnel, climate change will still be there. So how can we as individuals and as communities do a better job of engaging with this really pressing issue and activating our communities to become leaders in mitigating and adapting to climate change? At San Francisco State, we feel like education is the first step towards action. As such, students, staff, and faculty have banded together to create a new certificate in climate change studies. The certificate features 4 different courses, the first in foundations, the second one in causes, then impacts and solutions. These courses are interdisciplinary in nature. You need not be a science expert to do well and to learn from these courses. And they really provide you with a broad spectrum of things that you can learn about and think about. We're hoping that thousands of students and community members will sign up for these courses, and become leaders in climate change in the community. To learn more about the certificate, which will launch next fall, please go to our Climate HQ website. We'll have the list of courses, we'll have a list of advisors, and all of that as we progress through the summer in advance of the fall. So we're hoping that you'll join us for this exciting certificate and that this will help mobilize us as a community to do the work that has to be done. Thank you so much. Take care.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here at Climate HQ. I'm Macy Tollison, and it is my great honor to welcome you to the very first installment of our new event series, Climate Watch, We Are the Change. This episode will feature 2 interactive panels that will address the communication challenges stalling climate action and explore avenues of how to take action in your local communities. We will be taking your questions live and conducting polls throughout the broadcast. So before we get started, we would like to introduce Climate HQ correspondents Chelsea Barron and Katie Walker to help you navigate the interactive portion of our program.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie.
And I'm Chelsea.
We'll be here with you throughout the panel, taking questions from the audience,
as well as asking some questions ourselves in the form of polls. Speaking of questions, how should our audience ask questions to our panelists, Katie?
I'm glad you asked. If you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to type them into the YouTube Live chat box below. Please remember to keep all questions on topic and respectful. Chelsea and I will be reading through them.
That's right. I will also be sending poll links into the chat box throughout the panel, but don't worry, it's not a test. The polls will contain simple multiple choice questions to which there are no right or wrong answers. After 2 to 3 minutes, the poll results will be shown on screen, so if you're interested, participate fast.
And what will poll links look like, Chelsea?
Like this. I just sent a demo poll link into the chat box below. Click it and check it out, everybody.
Nice. So easy.
Easy peasy. I'll show the results soon.
And in the meantime, on behalf of our entire class, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have fun listening, asking, and answering along with us.
Results are in. Let's throw those up on screen.
Ooh, it works. I think we're ready, Chelsea.
I think so too, Katie. Thank you for your responses, everybody. We will see you after the first panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, ladies. We'll see you after the panel. And a quick reminder for our audience, don't forget to send your questions to us either in the comments section or on social media. Tonight on Climate Watch, founder of Principle 1226 Solutions, Cad Smith, and local Clean Energy Alliance organizer, Jessica Guadalupe Tovar, will join us in the program to talk about civic engagement with our Climate HQ correspondent, Dre Christopher. But first, our own Genesis Del Rio will sit down with marine ecologist and Santa Clara University lecturer, Dr. Daria Siciliano, and San Francisco State's professor of race and resistance studies, Dr. Logan Hennessy, to debate the communication challenges that are stalling climate action. Now, before we hand things over to Genesis for our first panel, we would love to play a video released on Earth Day by 18-year-old activist Greta Thunberg. This piece is titled Mind the Gap.
Specially built receivers are automatically activated to warn of the impending hazard.
Earth Day 2021. At the Leaders Climate Summit, countries will present their new climate commitments, like net zero emissions by 2050. They will call these hypothetical targets ambitious. But when you compare our insufficient targets with the overall current best available science, you clearly see that there's a gap. There are decades missing. Of course, we welcome all efforts to safeguard present and future living conditions, and these targets could be a great start if it wasn't for the fact that they are full of gaps and loopholes, like leaving out emissions from consumption of imported goods, as well as international aviation, shipping, and the burning of biomass, using baseline manipulation, excluding most tipping points and feedback loops, and ignoring the global aspect of equity and historic emissions, as well as making these targets completely relying on future fantasy-scaled, currently barely existing negative emissions technologies. The point is, or as we say in Swedish, the sum of the cardamom is that we can keep cheating in order to pretend that these targets are in line with what is needed. But while we can fool others, and even ourselves, we cannot fool nature and physics. The emissions are still there, whether we choose to count them or not. When leaders now present these very insufficient targets, they admit that they are surrendering on the 1.5 degree target, surrendering on their promises and on our futures. Still, as it is now, world leaders get away with it, since the gap of awareness is so immense. And this is the heart of the problem. We understand that the world is very complex, that many are trying their best, and that this isn't going to be easy. And of course, these very insufficient targets are better than nothing. But we cannot be satisfied with something just because it's better than nothing. We have to go further than that. We must believe that we can do this, because we can. I don't know about you, but I sure am not willing to give up. Not in a million years. We will keep on demanding and fighting for a safe future. Every fraction of a degree matters, and will always matter. You may call us naive for believing that change is possible. But at least we are not so naive that we believe that things will be fixed by companies in countries making vague, distant, hypothetical targets without any real pressure from the media and the general public. The gap between what we are doing and what needs to be done is widening by the minute. And the gap between the urgency needed and the current level of awareness and attention is becoming more and more absurd. And the gap between our so-called climate targets and the overall current best available science should no longer be possible to ignore. There are several decades missing. This gap of awareness, action, and time is the biggest elephant that has ever found itself in any room. And unless we address this, we cannot achieve any real changes. And no real solutions will be found. Let's call out their bullshit and please mind the gap.
Hey
Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
That very same day, President Biden gathered leaders from around the world and promised to, quote, cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade and reach net zero emissions by 2050. Let's hope he keeps that promise. And on that note, we'll remind our viewers to get their questions into our panelists as we begin our discussion about what's been stalling climate action. So to get us started, we'll send it over to Climate HQ correspondent once again, Genesis Del Rio. Take it away, Genesis.
Thank you, everyone. Excuse me. Thank you, Macy. Hello, everyone. My name is Jakar. Well, first, we had a little technical difficulties, so Genesis isn't here right now, but I'm feeling it. It's my pleasure. I'd like to introduce Dr. Daria Siciliano and Dr. Logan Hennessy as our first two panelists. Dr. Siciliano has over a decade worth of experience working in both marine sciences and policies that shape it. Drawing on her background in science and science diplomacy today, we hope to examine some of the shared issues we as people face, and when it comes to climate change in our oceans, as well as we might look toward possible solutions to address these issues. I would like to also introduce Dr. Logan Hennessy, an SF State Professor of Race and Resistance Studies. Dr. Hennessy's work revolves around the politics of indigenous environments and mining and oil industries. Excuse me, sorry about that. He's currently studying the social and environmental consequences of infrastructure projects in South America, sustainability attempts in the mining industry, and indigenous rights and climate change debates. Please welcome both Dr. Siciliano and Dr. Hennessy. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to start off with you guys by asking you guys both if you guys can tell us, the audience, a little bit about some of your most current projects and what can we look forward what projects do you guys have going forward? Dr. Siciliano, I'd like to start with you first, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Drakar. As you mentioned, I'm a marine ecologist, and my specialty, my research is in coral reef ecology. So I study an ecosystem that is particularly threatened by climate change. And as part of my work, I often travel, of course, not the last year and a half because of COVID, but I travel to tropical countries, nations that, as you stated in your introduction, they are the countries that more often, they're the ones that have contributed the least to the climate crisis, yet they're paying the steepest price. And I often, so for example, I worked in Fiji's, in the Marshall Islands. I studied the coral reefs of these nations. And one thing that strikes me every time I do field work is the fact that the people I work with in these places, they're keenly aware of climate change. When I come back to the United States, we are, a privileged country. And as you mentioned, I teach at the university, at Santa Clara University. And, the students, the people around me, even my own family, is not aware as much as the people that I work with in the countries that I visit for my work. And what part of my mission and my passion and part of the things that I try to do in my work, I'm a marine ecologist, so I study biodiversity of coral reefs. But what I try to do also is, bridge this gap of understanding and knowledge and awareness. And I try to do that as part of my teaching, as I teach students here, and I see that they don't see the urgency and they don't perceive the climate crisis nearly as an urgent matter as the people that I work with when I travel, to the tropical countries, to the places that I study. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hennessy.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jakar, and it's great to be a part of this whole event. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Huichun, which is the unceded lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I also wanted to have a quick shout out to all the moms because it's almost Mother's Day, and I know there's a lot of moms that were involved in creating this event, including Erica Pulley, who is the most amazing multitasker for pulling this off. So thanks to all the moms, and happy Mother's Day, everybody. I come to my research and teaching from the perspective of the connection between forests and extractive industries and the communities that live in forests and deal with these problems on a regular basis. My research began in South America, looking at the connections between oil development and its impacts on tropical forests and indigenous communities in Ecuador. And I also continued to do work on these similar topics, looking at the problems around small-scale mining in Guyana, in South America. So in some ways, Dr. Siciliano and myself are really representing the two most biodiverse bioregions in the world, with the marine ecosystems and tropical forests, and the kinds of struggles that communities that live and inhabit these regions deal with to try and survive in our modern world. Recently, I've been looking at new projects connecting these things. Right now, myself and a colleague at San Francisco State are really interested in looking at the connections between the impacts of oil on microbial diversity. We're living in this new, almost like this microbial revolution in research, and looking at the role that these small microorganisms are playing in overall ecosystem health. And so one project we're curious about is what has been the impact of oil extraction on microbial diversity. But I'm also interested in the relationship that indigenous peoples and communities play in some of these larger debates and discussions around protecting indigenous rights in climate change negotiations in places like the United Nations. So I've been keeping up with that as much as I can, attending a few of these meetings internationally and networking with folks to figure out what are the obstacles to getting indigenous rights recognized in some of these United Nations negotiations. And in general, I just try to keep up with deforestation research. I'm looking at some new connections between these issues in these field sites that I normally visit.
Thank you. Listening and just looking at the scope of both you guys' work, I can kind of get a sense of your passion. But I would like you guys to elaborate a little bit more. If you could tell me what got you inspired to become an educator and to be in a position that you guys are in right now. Same, either one you guys might go ahead, go first.
I'll go first if you want. Well, for me, I had the privilege of doing a semester abroad as an undergraduate studying tropical ecology in Ecuador. And initially, it was mostly ecology based. We were just trying to understand how things like the forest and the mountain forests and the coastal regions are all work, as a natural system. But I had this interaction and this experience when we were in the Amazon, and I met an indigenous family and learned a little bit about the fact that family was fighting to survive on the frontier of new oil projects that were linked to United States oil companies. And to me, it really felt like an injustice, and especially since we as consumers here in the United States are actually importing that oil from these countries. So that's one of the moments that really led to a lot of questions that I had, and the pursuit of graduate school, and in graduate school I dug back into these issues, went back to South America to study these issues some more, and fell in love with teaching along the way. as that was what I was doing as a graduate student, is teaching, learning about these problems and studying them as much as I could.
Thank you. Dr. Susiano, same question. I would like to ask you about your passion. What got you into being an educator?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Italy and Venezuela. It's a complicated family history, but my dad lived in Venezuela, my mom lived in Italy. Eventually they split up, but my brother and I shuttled between the two countries, and I've had in both countries, right? Italy is a peninsula, lots of coastline, spent lots of time in the water there. But also in Venezuela, I started to get to know the ecosystems that I now studying. I had my first experience just snorkeling through a coral reef when I was, a little kid. And I just, all the colors and the, just the curiosity about all of this organisms that were, just coming alive as soon as I put a mask on. And as the years went on, I remember specifically an instance where my brother and I and my friends used to love to visit this island off of Venezuela, Morocco National Park. It's a beautiful location. There used to be this vibrant coral reef there that we visited summer after summer, and then one summer we came back and it was dead. It was completely gone, and we were just shocked, and there wasn't a lot of information about what happened. There was for many years, actually, the truth didn't come out. What happened was there was a chemical spill, but there was a nearby oil refinery. But the bottom line is this didn't come. It wasn't. It was covered. It was covered up, and I remember just the shock and the sadness, and that really planted the seed for me to wanting to study this marvelous ecosystem. What we can do, like how can we prevent this important ecosystem, such biodiverse ecosystem, to disappear. And then I also, growing up in Venezuela, I realized I came to understand this very deep connection that is between the people that lives on the coastline, that fish on these coral reefs, that live off of these marine communities, and how they care for the communities, for the marine ecosystems to be healthy and vibrant, because their children are going to eat if the reef is healthy and it's well managed, right? So all those things really planted the seed for me to then go to graduate school, just like Professor Hennessy was mentioning. You just become so passionate about this, and you go to graduate school, and I studied the coral reefs of Hawaii in graduate school, and like your introductions for this panel, you were talking about how education is the first step toward action. And if you're in environmental science, especially if you're studying an ecosystem that is particularly threatened and disappearing, you are inspired to teach and to share what you know with others, and you want to share with as many people as possible. You want to, especially particularly grateful when you can plant a seed in other people the same way that a seed was planted with me, either by teachers or by the particular experience of our upbringing. And I just add one more thing. I teach a conservation science class at Santa Clara University, and as part of that class, one of the assignments is an essay, and the students have to reflect on why do you care about conservation? Obviously, if they're taking that class, they're environmental science students, usually seniors. Why do you care about conserving our natural resources? And usually the students mention either some particular event in their upbringing, just like in my case, or a particular, a teacher that really inspired them. And these are now students who are going to be the environmental leaders of tomorrow, just like all of you. So this is what makes a teacher. That's the most rewarding thing, is when you communicate your passion and your urgent, your desire for urgent action to the new generation, to the next generation.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Which brings me to my next question, and because you guys do different work, but the goal is for environmental justice, and I would like to ask you both, what do you guys think what is the difference in between your work in your public sphere versus your work in the classroom? Like, what do you guys see, or from your experiences, what has been the difference, and from being in the classroom and then taking that information that you guys learn and going and applying it to the real world? Dr. Logan Hennessy, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I did want to add one little correction. I'm in a department called Liberal Studies, which is an interdisciplinary degree program, which also provides some of the training that future teachers in the state of California want to pursue. So a lot of times my students are going to be educators themselves. They're going to be K through 8 educators. One of the things that I guess is challenging is the kind of, as a scholar, there's a real complexity to all of these problems, especially climate change. It's so monumental, and it has so many different factors and dimensions. And so, as a professor, I want to share that complexity with my students, and I want them to try and understand it, and I want them to see as many of these dimensions as possible. And I feel like that sometimes is the real big disconnect between a classroom versus the public, and the way in which sometimes these issues get discussed in the public sphere may often maybe simplify things into just simple issues, such as, well, just drive more electric cars and stop gasoline, or stop using oil, phase out fossil fuels. Those are important dimensions, but it gets a lot deeper than that. And so sometimes I feel like you can get into that depth with your students in the classroom, but it's not always possible to have that kind of depth of conversation elsewhere without having the time, right? The time to spend on getting into the immensity of the issues. So that's one of the factors that I kind of see in terms of that relationship.
I would say, so you would say, like, the ability to execute that same information into the real world is really quite challenging. Would you agree with that?
To some degree. I mean, for me, one of the when I got a passion to start talking specifically with my classes and my students about climate change was reading some of the United Nations reports. I remember distinctly reading what they call the fourth assessment report from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it was step by step, sort of global in its scope and systemic, and talked about everything from almost every environment you could imagine, not only impacts on the planet and the biodiversity and the natural systems, but also impacts on the human systems. And I remember feeling kind of a sense of overwhelming, just being overwhelmed by it. I mean, it had so much richness to it, and that's the kind of thing that I think is not always part of the public debate, right? Is the entire the nuances of climate change impacts in every corner of the Earth. It's not just about reducing the carbon atmosphere. It's about how this is impacting different places and what we can do about it. And that's, I think, what oftentimes gets lost in a lot of the simplified versions of these discussions in the media, for example.
Right. Dr. Luciano, I'm sorry. I would like to offer you the same question. Are there any differences between the ways in which you communicate about the environment in an academic setting versus a public setting?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I completely agree with what Dr. Hennessy's just mentioned. And as scientists, I think we spend as trainee in science. So when we go to graduate school, for example, especially in my field, especially in natural sciences, there's not nearly, even though I went to, a very good school, University of California, Santa Cruz, excellent program, there just wasn't enough of an emphasis in my program, training me as a scientist and, an educator eventually. They didn't teach me enough. I had to sort of find the resources myself, how to communicate to people, not to other scientists, right? This is a problem in general in science, is that we are trained to go and give talks at scientific conferences with other academics that read the same obscure scientific journals as we do every day, but this is not how we can connect to people. And so when I then became an educator, and even just in my everyday conversation with people, just I realized, one, just what Professor Hennessy was talking about, just how best to communicate the complexity of climate change, but also one of the other problem that I find, the problem as I teach, and I teach, people your age, Dakar, the new generation, and right now the emphasis is on the here and now, and social media, and Facebook, and there's this temporal dissonance with climate change. The fact that we talk about the urgency of climate change and the climate crisis, and we don't see it, right? It's not happening tomorrow, it's not happening tonight. But those are the time frames that the new generation, and I have children myself, I struggle with this as a mom. The new generation is just gearing up to think about the present and communicate about the present, and this very short time frames. And one of the problems about communicating about climate change is we talk about this being an urgent issue, but this is an urgent issue that is 50, 100 years away, in many cases, shorter in certain facets. But when I talk about studying coral reef ecosystems, and that scientists like me are very concerned about the fact that in 50 years we may not have a coral reef. That means that my grandchildren will, may not experience the same snorkeling magic that I've experienced as a kid, that turned me to studying these ecosystems. Then that's 50 and 100 years away, right? And that's the problem with climate change, the fact that it's happening fast, it's happening, gradually, gradually, but it's not something that we can, that's here tomorrow, right? It's already here in many ways. So the way that I, bridge that gap is, to talking about the fires, this fire season that now we have in California, and it's happening and we know it's going to happen this September. So, this is something that students, it's more within the time frame that the younger generation relates to. But that's one of the challenges. That's one of the problems, is this temporal dissonance.
You mentioned something. You mentioned social media, and how our generations now are more of we're such and I can speak for our generation, we're such a now, like if we don't see it now, it's not happening now. Climate change, would you agree that climate change isn't something that is in the future? It's something that's been here and it's been present, and a lot of people are just looking at it as a current situation.
Yeah, talking for me?
Yes.
Absolutely. The climate change has been here, has been here for years. But it's a gradual, it's like, it's a gradual progression. And that's the problem, is that if we compare what's happening now with 10 years ago, climate change is here. We didn't have fire season 3-4 years ago, right? We, this is now going to be a recurrent issue. It's very much the effect of climate change. But climate change is here, but it's the time scales that we're talking about in terms of our infrastructure being underwater, it's still not within the time frame, I'm afraid, that most of us are getting used to right now with social media and with the pace of digital communications. That is not even a few years from now, 20 years from now. Some models predict that some major infrastructure in the Bay Area, our airports, depending on, of course, our trajectories from now, between now and 20 years from now, are going to be underwater. So San Francisco Airport, Oakland Airport is going to be underwater. That's 20 years away, according to some models. And yet 20 years away is still, it's nothing. It's a very short time, but it's still too long of a time sometime to inspire action, unless you phrase these issues in a way that is relatable to what's happening to a person's life in that moment. And that's, I think, our challenge as educators.
Yeah. Can I add to that?
Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I would add that another challenge is sometimes to get students and the public to think about it from a real global perspective of what is happening right now in other places of the world. It's hard for perhaps some folks to as Dr. Siciliano mentioned, see those challenges right now, here, today, outside, or whatever. But in other places, people are actually living these challenges on an everyday basis. I mean, their crops are not, producing the yields that they used to, or the trees are migrating up and down slopes depending on the local. The rain is not coming as much as it used to. They're facing droughts. In the polar regions, people are, suffering from permafrost melting and their houses being swallowed, by the ground and by the ocean. So that kind of disconnection, I think, is important as educators to connect with our students, and also to try and share out with the public too, because it is something that is happening every day in different parts of the world, and a lot of people have trouble understanding that and have trouble being aware of what's going on. That's one point. And the other point is, a lot of people that are living these experiences are struggling. They're struggling to resist these impacts. They're struggling to survive, and in some cases, they're struggling in context of violence. Right, the violence of continued resource extraction, the violence of continued development, which is heavily impacting their everyday lives, and that, I think, is also sometimes lost in the disconnection between the way in which we can try to understand that with lots of time in a single course class, but maybe not always so much in the broader public debates.
You guys both talked about hurdles and speaking on environmental issues, and I want to reiterate it and make it really clear to everyone. If you guys both can just elaborate on some of your biggest hurdles on talking about environmental issues, and how much you think apathy play a role in people listening and being there and willing to have those conversations? Dr. Cinciano, would you like to start?
Yeah, so how to combat, to better understand your question, Drakkar, how to combat the apathy? Is that what you're asking?
I'm sorry, let me ask again. So you guys had mentioned there's the hurdles of talking about environmental issues with, like, in a public space and having that dialogue. I was just wondering if you guys can, like, really pinpoint or tell me why do you think it's so difficult having environmental conversations in a public space and that are in a public space that are not non-academic?
So yeah, the first thing, if I may start, the first thing I would say is there is a cultural element here too. And I think Dr. Hennessy was mentioning this. If I'm here in the United States, it's one thing. If I'm talking about climate change in Europe, if I'm visiting my mom, for example, it's different. It's a different conversation. And if I'm talking about climate change in the Marshall Islands to my friends there, it's an entirely different conversation. So this is very much, it has this important cultural context. If we're talking about the United States here, right? So for example, in Europe, when I go and talk about climate change to some friends and colleagues there, there is a lot less. The subject is, first of all, a lot less loaded. It's lost. There's more, there's a lot more acceptance generally that climate change is happening. And as we know, this is not always the case here, and this is part of the complexity about talking about climate change. That it's often it's perceived as, it's a political subject, and in other countries it's not so. It's certainly not. It's a scientific subject, and it's a subject that affects all of our lives in many different ways. But here in this country, there is that element of, it's also part of a political conversation, and the challenges in communicating it again is, one, breaking down the complexity in a way that does justice to the science. But you're going to very quickly lose whomever you're talking to, even the most interested people that are not scientists, if you start talking about tipping points and feedback loops and and the rate at which glaciers are, you want to simplify, but it's hard to simplify such a complex matter. And then, of course, what we talked about, the fact that this is happening very gradually over decades, and how do you best convey the urgency about it when you're still talking about years away? Even though climate change is happening now, but often we're trying to set policy, we're trying to address problems, and sea level rise, at least here where we're living, it's really not going to affect our everyday life where we're living here. But like Dr. Hennessy was saying, there's climate refugees in the Marshall Islands right now. They've been evacuated by their islands they've occupied for millennia, and they're now basically without a home. They're refugees, but we're going to have climate refugees in the United States, starting in the next few years. So things are happening quickly, but perhaps not quickly enough to really get the attentions of as many people as we need to focus their attention on this important issue.
Thank you so much. Sir.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it is fascinating to spend time in other countries where it's not, it's not hushed, it's not repressed, it's part of the everyday life and discussion. And here I feel like sometimes the barriers that we face have to do with convincing people to understand that they are members of the global community, and to not to see themselves as insular, as thinking in limited terms, or being self-centered, right? I mean, to accept climate change and to accept its ramifications means to be a member of a global community. And I feel like that's one of the initial barriers that you might face when you're talking to someone who is giving you some resistance, is that they just don't see themselves as needing to have that kind of consciousness. So that's one of the big battles that you're always going to face. But on the other hand, I feel like that there are tools to use, and one of them is the fact that climate change, because it is so systemic, also presents opportunities to engage people in conversations that perhaps they weren't expecting, in the sense that if you can make a connection to something that they could possibly experience or already are experiencing in relation to climate change, then they might be more willing to continue that discussion and to be thinking about it, right? So if you're talking to people in parts of this country that initially might not be thinking about climate change, and you happen to mention, well, hey, did you see this report, or did you consider what the impacts might be on your local economy if a few of these things might happen? If you start to see changes in crop patterns and growth, if you start to see changes in local economic activity, then they might be more open to it. And actually, that is what's happening. You start to see people become aware as it is making its impact on them in places that probably we would have expected would be the last ones to think about it. So I feel like that's one of the best tools you can use in these conversations is to try to make those connections to things that they might be experiencing right now. And that would open up doors to having bigger conversations about the rest of it.
I would like to thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we sadly ran a little bit over time. Thank you, Dr. Dario Salesiano and Dr. Logan Hennessy, for being with us. It's been a truly pleasure. We would like to switch to our next. We like to switch from our first panel to our next panel. Thank you to all our viewers for sending questions in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being our host.
Thank you. Now we'll have to let Chelsea Barron take it away, please.
Yes. Thank you, Dre. And of course, thank you to Dr. Siciliano and Dr. Hennessy. I am Chelsea, coming at you live at the SFSU Climate Poll headquarters, where coincidentally, I have spent the entire pandemic. Well, as Professor Bill Sokol might say, it's showtime for you, the viewers. Our first interactive poll question will now be available in chat, so please click and answer now. The question is, where do you receive most of your news about the environment? You have 60 seconds to answer, but no pressure. Now, as you answer, I will give a little recap for those who are joining the panel late. From our intro video, we have learned that environmental issues are social issues. We have learned that education is the first step to action. We have learned that San Francisco State is developing a climate certificate consisting of 4 interdisciplinary course focuses in foundational studies, causes, impacts, and solutions for climate change. Greta Thunberg helped point out the gap between what we are doing and what we should be doing, and Dr. Siciliano and Dr. Hennessy communicated their desire for a conversation about urgent action and navigating the complexity of speaking about environmental issues, simply communicating without oversimplifying, doing them the justice that the brevity of such a topic deserves. And fun fact, if you're interested in learning more about Dr. Siciliano's, it looks like the timer's up, but I'd like to tell you, if you're interested in learning more about Dr. Siciliano's research with coral reefs in Cuba, her research was featured in the IMAX film Cuba, Journey to the Heart of the Caribbean. Now, let's see those poll results. All right, results are in. Thank you to everyone for participating. Macy, we're gonna send it back to you.
Chelsea, and special thank you to Dr. Hennessy and Dr. Siciliano for joining our program. Well, that wraps up the first half of our show. And next up, Jessica Guadalupe Tovar of Local Clean Energy Alliance and Cad Smith of 1226 Solutions are here to talk to you about civic engagement and defining environmental racism. Don't forget, again, to get your questions into us on social media or in the comments below. We'll be right back after this short break.
With coronavirus protocols, the industry of travel and wildlife and conservation, it's a bloodbath. I've worked in travel for over 30 years. I'm a guide, I'm a photographer, I'm a conservationist, I raise money, and I get angry every day. You can't raise money just for a species, where are you going to pay? Most of that money has gone on local education. I'm quite sure there are species in America that are suffering right now. But education, people have to understand, and if they want to support financially, that they go about it in the right way. That's very important. My campaign with tigers, I've got lots of other campaigns, but with tigers, has always been worth more alive. They are, if you imagine a Bengal tiger poached, imagine it on the slab. You know, it's been shot, it's been poached. It's probably worth $35,000. That's a lot. If that tigress, for example, let's call it a female, lives a full life, maybe has 4 litters, imagine the benefit to everybody involved with that tiger, all the ancillary benefits, even the guy who cuts hair for tourists in the local village, to the rangers, the guides, the park authorities, everything. That tiger could be worth as much as $80 million. With any endangered species, you know, once you've done your research, once you've understood, save up, borrow, get money off your parents, do 2 jobs, do anything. Because however much you watch Attenborough, Animal Planet, Nat Geo, whatever, and I know a lot of, I've worked with these cameramen, I've worked with these presenters, some of them are close friends, you will feel diametrically different than looking in a screen or a, you know, or a phone or whatever, when you actually come face to face with one. I didn't know it was going to affect me as it has done for 22 years. But I think it was knowing that 8 months later, the pelt of that animal was sat on the back of somebody in China. You can imagine how that made me feel, and it still makes me angry now. And if you don't wake up angry about things like that, I don't think you can call yourself a conservationist.
Good afternoon and happy Friday. I'm Laura Burris and I'm chair of the biology department at San Francisco State University. We're here today to talk about an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore would say, or an uncomfortable truth, as I would say. And it's deeply uncomfortable because I, even as a scientist, haven't felt like I really know what to do and how to be part of the solution instead of the part of the climate change problem. For the last year and a half, we've been in a long, dark pandemic tunnel. Even though we now can see the light at the end of that tunnel, we know that when we went into that tunnel, we had climate change, and we also know that when we come out of that tunnel, climate change will still be there. So how can we as individuals and as communities do a better job of engaging with this really pressing issue and activating our communities to become leaders in mitigating and adapting to climate change? At San Francisco State, we feel like education is the first step towards action. As such, students, staff, and faculty have banded together to create a new certificate in climate change studies. The certificate features 4 different courses, the first in foundations, the second one in causes, then impacts and solutions. These courses are interdisciplinary in nature. You need not be a science expert to do well and to learn from these courses. And they really provide you with a broad spectrum of things that you can learn about and think about. We're hoping that thousands of students and community members will sign up for these courses and become leaders in climate change around in the community. To learn more about this certificate, which will launch next fall, please go to our Climate HQ website. We'll have the list of courses, we'll have a list of advisors, and all of that as we progress through the summer in advance of the fall. So we're hoping that you'll join us for this exciting certificate and that this will help mobilize us as a community to do the work that has to be done. Thank you so much. Take care.
Chelsea, and special thank you to Dr. Hennessy and Dr. Siciliano for joining our program. Well, that wraps up the first half of our show. And next up, Jessica Guadalupe Tovar of Local Clean Energy Alliance and Cad Smith of 1226 Solutions are here to talk to you. For those of you just joining us, we just wrapped our first panel on the communication challenges stalling climate action with Dr. Logan Hennessy and Dr. Daria Siciliano. Please join our virtual community to continue the discussion. And now, without further ado, for our second panel, I will turn it over to Climate HQ's Dre Christopher. Good evening, Dre.
On your left side, it should be by your name. It should be a microphone. Hello, welcome in. Thank you again, Macy. Panelist B, we have Cad Smith and we have Jessica Guadalupe Tovar. Cad is a Bay Area native who is passionate about changing the material conditions of BIC. That's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, individuals across the country. He spends much of his time focusing on civic engagement, political education, climate justice, and currently serve on the board of directors for the Ecology Center in Berkeley. Jessica is a longtime environmental justice community organizer, community warrior, working with the local Clean Energy Alliance for Energy Democracy in the Bay Area. She's helped shut down the PG&E Hunters Point power plant in 2004 and in 2010, successfully mobilizing against a tar sands dirty crude explosion of the Chevron's Richmond oil refinery. Excuse me, I'm sorry I butchered that. She currently promotes equality and clean energy as a coordinator at East Bay Clean Power Alliances. Please welcome both Jessica and Cad. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great, thank you.
Blessed, all things considered. Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you guys for coming on. So I just wanted to start off with you guys. I want to ask you guys both, what is environmental justice and environmental racism to you guys?
Okay, should I go first?
Yes, sure, please.
Okay, yeah, so environmental racism is really about the systematic placement of polluting industries in communities of low income and people of color. And that's how I would define it. And it's intentional, right? Putting dirty facilities in communities of color and compromising their health and livelihood is really a systemic practice. That's why we call it environmental racism.
Okay, thank you. Cad, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Cad Smith. Pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm calling in on Ohlone land. I think environmental racism is state-sanctioned violence towards folks of color and people who live in marginalized communities by way of what Jessica just described, which is environmental policy that has inherently baked into it discriminatory considerations. So for me, growing up in West Berkeley, that's looking around and seeing all my neighbors who were folks of color having asthma and saying, why is that? It's knowing that manufacturing companies that have toxic outputs are located in communities where they have been designated or deemed to be appropriately positioned. So growing up in Berkeley, I didn't see those type of manufacturing facilities or whatnot north side of Solano. So environmental racism is the way in which state-sanctioned violence happens in communities of color when it comes to environmental policy.
So I like that answer. You guys both made it easy to segue into this next question. Just from hearing your both answers, I would like to start with you, Cad, first, and Jessica, if you mind going afterwards. If you can be more precise, what was your inspiration for pursuing a career in climate activism or in climate justice?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for me, it was food justice work. So I remember growing up in what we used to call the waterfront in West Berkeley. Now through the gentrification, I don't know what they call it, but I remember growing up, there was no grocery stores in our community, man. So it was corner stores, liquor stores, Bonar Street, whatever the case may be, but you didn't actually have many grocery stores or access to fresh organic produce. So when I was about 16 years old, angry at the world, hormonal teenager, one of my friends was like, "Yo, I see you got so many things that you kind of curious about. Why don't you come check out this produce stand that I'm running?" And shout out Via Rose. I walked over to BYA, Berkeley Youth Alternatives, where that produce stand was set up, and I got exposed to the idea of being able to sell fresh organic produce that was curated and harvested by farmers of color, communities of color. And I just remember how that experience gave me a whole systems analysis and really was my first inroad to like formal political education. So that's where my passion for environmental justice really stems from.
Thank Jessica. Would you have anything that would you like to add on to that?
Oh, sure. Well, my upbringing certainly really was a catalyst for what I do today. I grew up in housing projects in East Los Angeles and nearby, pretty much the main street that I lived on. The next side of the street, the other side of the block, was called City of Vernon, which is an all industrial city. So I grew up next to all kinds of factories and diesel traffic, and these factories were like crematoriums, for humans, animals, because there's actually a slaughterhouse in East LA, Farmer John's. So I grew up with a lot of diesel traffic, a lot of factories in my neighborhood. And a lot of pollution. It smelled really bad. And I was pretty ignorant about that. And then there was a point where my mom became ill. She developed cancer while I was a student. And I learned from a friend about environmental justice. And I was like, I felt like I could relate to that. And I wanted to do something about that because I started to explore the rest of the world and it wasn't like my neighborhood. And we were all very poor, Latino, Mexican, immigrant community, and we were ignorant about what we were living by, and we weren't reaping the financial benefit of the businesses that were around us, right? But I also was noting the pattern of health effects on people, including myself. I have disabilities. I have trouble concentrating. I've had allergies. And I mentioned my mother developed breast cancer. My grandmother developed breast cancer. My grandmother died of breast cancer. And it's prevalent in the community where I grew up. So that really is what got me doing this work, really, is that personal experience. And similar to the community you described, again, there were no fresh, produce markets in my neighborhood. It's very easy to get a hold of the bad, unhealthy stuff than it was to get healthy foods. So, my community was also a food desert, amongst many other things. So, yeah, that's really what influenced me to do this work.
So you guys both mentioned a little bit about your upbringing and what how it ties into you being into the profession you guys in now. If you guys don't mind explaining to me a little bit more, how does environmental inequalities go unseen by the average person? If Jessica, would you mind starting with that?
Mhm. How does it go unseen?
By the
Well,
average, yeah.
the average person, unless, I going back to my personal experience, unless you're affected and and recognize the inequality, you might not notice, right? If you have the privilege of living in a clean environment, clean neighborhood, being able to easily access, fresh produce, then you might not know how other people in other communities live, and how much we go without and how much we struggle, um, and deal with a lot of health issues. If you're a healthy person, able-bodied person, you're unaware of other people's struggles, and it's don't wait till it happens to you. you know we need to make sure that there's equity in the world, and that we all have access to clean air, clean water, um and basic human rights, right? So I it's for me, it's like I can't unsee what I grew up with. um but I think the fact that we're having these discussions really helps other folks who might have privilege to understand what folks like me are dealing with, and what our communities of color are dealing with in terms of being exposed to you know dirty operations of these facilities, whatever it is, right? And in my case, I described some of it. I also grew up around gas-fired power plants and transmission wire infrastructure, electricity transformers. I mean, all kinds of really, crazy stuff. Um, and just too much of it, like in my backyard, right? So how people go about their day without noticing, yeah, that's a good question. Because I see it every day.
Would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, it's a proximity challenge. Honestly, I think it's a proximity challenge for sure. So I think it's through maturation and like lived experience. The older I get, the more my world broadens, and the more people I get to meet, the more I get to hear about experiences that allows for pattern recognition, right? So you see folks who grow up south of MLK in any major urban city, and they start to talk about the same type of patterns, right? Like, dang, didn't have access to food, had factories, had asthma, had lung cancer. And so you start thinking about this pattern recognition and start to say, this isn't happening by coincidence, it's by design. And so for me, the average person doesn't have a lot of incentives. And I will say the average person's psyche is transforming with the access to information and with more online engagement, but it's not by, there's not a lot of incentivization by the kind of corporate powers at B right now for us to have heightened people powered awareness on what's going on in our community. So I say all that because for me, going and working with the Ecology Center or now working with Greenpeace, you see like some of the things that you see as far as where our waste ends up at, whether it's in our recycle and waste processing centers here in the US, or how it impacts our oceans, or what it does to overseas processing centers. And you can't really unsee it, to Jessica's point. And I do think this question that was kind of brought up earlier around seeing ourselves as global citizens, there's a mass force of enculturation to really think about American exceptionalism in a way that we got to come to terms with. Like, America is going to be the solution for the global crisis. And it has to happen at a global level with a local understanding of what we can do day in and day out. And that kind of pivot for the average person, I do think comes down to proximity. So what you see in your community and how you're able to impact the change, and then being able to connect the dots across the state, across the country, and across the globe around how, when you're in solidarity with other folks doing that, how that might preserve and also transform the human experience for the centuries to come. So pattern recognition and proximity are two huge things, I think, for changing what the average person's response is.
Okay. Cass, so you talked a little bit about the Greenpeace, and I briefly introduced you working at the Ecology Center. I was wondering, and this is kind of a little two-part question for both you guys. Kat, if you don't mind starting first. First, you could tell me a little bit about what you do at the Ecology Center, and like, what is that like? Why was some, just informing the public on jobs, or like what do you guys do there? And also, Jessica, I would like you to tell me a little bit about the East Bay power lines. But also, with part B to this question is if you can describe how you combat environmental justice, and you can use your platform. You can use your platform at each of your professions to go ahead and elaborate.
I'll take the lead. I think I've been in relationship with the Ecology Center for 13 plus years now, it feels like. So now I'm sitting at the governance level at the board, on the board of directors as the vice chair. And so it's not my profession as a career, it's more so my passion project and kind of being quote unquote loyal to the soil. And what the Ecology Center does is it's a community asset for education and awareness. So whether that's around food and farming, if you go to a farmer's market in the city of Berkeley, Ecology Center got that for you. If you think about the recycling center for single family homes, Ecology Center got that for you. So it's thinking about urban ecology and how we have a different relationship to self-determination. Those are my words around what does it mean to truly be in choice about our energy. Community choice is one of the examples of a coalition project that the Ecology Center helped to work through. So the Ecology Center, in my humble opinion, is one of the more renowned institutions within the East Bay, within California, that's thinking about urban ecology in a way that promotes justice and that promotes equity. With Greenpeace, they really do have a global platform, and they're thinking quite often about democracy and our campaigns in the democratic space, the fundamental ways in which we can move towards more justice or towards more just outcomes is having active participation in our democratic system, and then also understanding how fossil fuels not going to be a sustainable pathway going forward in the future. So those two, the combination of those two organizations, it affords me kind of that local perspective through the Ecology Center and this global kind of cohesiveness through the Greenpeace work. And I'm also, again, in the governance level. So I say all that because it means thinking about organizations as vessels for social transformation. How do we truly listen to BIPOC leaders, Black, Indigenous, people of color leaders, around what they need in their communities, and then make sure that they're resourced accordingly. That's the work of nonprofit 501c3 and 501c4s as it pertains to 2021.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to. So I was gonna say, you're just to follow up with that, please, if you don't mind describing some of the, how you combat injustices, environmental justices and stuff in your community.
Please.
Yeah, specifically.
You want me to go or Jessica? I'm going to defer to Jessica first since I had a little bit of mic time right there.
Sure, Jessica, if you don't mind, telling us a little bit about the East Bay Clean Power Alliance, and then also telling us how you combat some environmental justices in your community.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so first and foremost, I work for an organization called Local Clean Energy Alliance, and I actually coordinate an alliance called the East Bay Clean Power Alliance, and our alliance pretty much was put together, was founded to advocate for a community choice energy program in the East Bay. And we really focused on, and just to be clear what community choice is, it's pretty much it's a policy that allows local cities and counties to take over the electrical portion of your bill. So like if you pay to PG&E, the line item for electricity will now come from your local community choice program. And so what was important to us was that we create a local agency that sells us electricity and lets us decide where our energy comes from. But we really wanted a program that not only sells us electricity, but invests back into the community in the form of community benefits, specifically investing in the development of low clean energy. And what that means is in our built environment, instead of getting our energy from away, we want to develop rooftop solar, not just on our homes, but think about like our municipal buildings, our libraries, our city hall, industrial buildings in our community. So it could be like the big box stores, or it could be, warehouses, for example. And doing that, throughout Alameda County would produce a lot of clean energy locally. That's a lot of jobs, clean energy jobs that we want to create. That's a lot of reduction in pollution, local pollution and regional pollution that would improve the health of our community, as well as truly reduce greenhouse gases. So that would improve the health of our climate as well. So it's a way to combat climate change, but inclusion of local people, creating that workforce. Remember I mentioned, folks who live by dirty energy facilities, they don't reap the economic benefits. As a matter of fact, our health is compromised in the name of profits. And in this case, we want to improve our communities and transform them into hubs of clean energy so that we can have that, clean energy transition that we've been envisioning for so long, um, and benefit from it in every which way. So East Bay Clean Power Alliance whole point is to advocate for local clean energy. And that isn't just solar, wind, and battery storage. It's also like, for example, energy efficiency, actually upgrading our homes, businesses, schools to be, not waste energy, right? If our homes are, like if it's cold right now and I'm running my heater and the home's inefficient, it means all that heat escaping my house has to be upgraded so that I don't have to be running my heater all day, right? To stay warm. And so that could be weatherizing the windows, for example. Just improving the building so that I don't have to use much energy. And then, other aspects would be, to take advantage of like, the sun coming through the window, for example, that's free energy right there. Um, and it's other programs as well that, are funded through our local community choice program, like seed funding for community innovation. There's a local grassroots group that created a co-op, People Powered Solar Cooperative. And, they were a recipient of a $40,000 grant. That's seed money to start projects in the community. So we created a community choice program that'll benefit us, not just sell us electricity, but invest back into the community. That's how we're approaching environmental justice, is by advocating for what we want in our communities, not just fighting for what we don't want, right?
Right. We actually have a question from a YouTube viewer. Haberdasher1 on YouTube would like to know. This is to address to both you guys. What can students or people from all backgrounds do today to make a difference in climate justice challenge? Jessica, Kat, would you like to start first?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is be very intentional about the choices you make. And I think that intentionality goes a long way. So it starts in your own home. What do you consume and where does it come from? Just asking that question, that we have like the full total sum of human knowledge, for better or worse, in these tiny devices that a lot of us have access to, right? So what you consume and where does it come from and what's the kind of carbon footprint in your own household, starting with that. The next thing I would say is just get attached to a community organization. Community organization are a group that inspires you in some meaningful way. So we talked about our experiences, seeing what was going on in our community and being able to be led or being able to lead with other organizers to address those challenges with solutions that make sense for us. If you can find an official organization or even an unofficial organization that just has an idea, attach yourself to it. There's power in people and there's strength in numbers. Shout out to Warriors. So what I will say is if you're able to lean into that type of principled engagement, you're going to see some beneficial aspect of giving your time, resourcing your energy, and the fruits of your labor in ways that I think keep you in the fight and keep you sustained and keep you kind of motivated to go at it. So that would be my offerings. What do you consume? Where does it come from? And getting attached to an organization that inspires
you. Jessica?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Definitely being conscious about, your consumption, exactly that. But, and certainly I benefited as a student from just volunteering with organizations that I was interested in, specifically organizations that are working on environmental justice issues. So, really using your time, and you might as a student think, I don't have time for that. You do have time. And you also have the luxury of using your creativity. Now that I'm an organizer and I'm campaigning, I don't have as much time for the creative part. So, having working, with students, volunteers to help me create content for my social media, to make my campaigns look more interesting, is very helpful. I mean, there's all kinds of things, for example, using technology. Us need help with that. And so, there's all kinds of ways that you can plug in to help an organization advance, what they're trying to work on in terms of winning some kind of justice campaign. So definitely get involved with an organization, a community group, or start one, even starting a student group to support issues around climate, environmental justice, climate justice, whatever it is that you're interested in, use that time. And because I did do that as a student, I was able to show that I had, experience organizing by the time I was done with school, because I was working with organizations and coordinating events, for example, putting together panels and Earth Day events and that kind of thing. And that's all valuable experience. Um, so definitely take the time, to get involved in something that interests you.
Get involved, people. Um, Jessica, I actually have a question for you. Judith F on YouTube would like to know, for the East Bay Clean Bay, for the East Bay Clean Energy Power Lines, how does the alliance communicate programs to general programs? And also, for low income families, how do they afford clean energy?
That's a great question. How do really the crux of the work that I do is really not about, the current system is if you have money, you own your home and you can afford to go solar, you can do that. That's not exactly all we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is how do we create solar systems, multifamily houses, renters, for example, so that we can have more affordability of clean energy, right? How do we electrify public transportation so that it's cleaner, right? Um, Coming up with ways that we can all benefit from clean energy and it isn't under this model of you can afford it, you can own it, and it's yours. That's not that's not sustainable. What we're really looking at is equity, right? And making sure that all people have a benefit. And so a lot of what I call it clean power to the people. How do we bring these benefits to low income people of color, renters, etc. And just to take it a bit further too, is that we're all energy, we all are energy users, we all have a energy, and it's more than just, I'll give you an example. I am a disabled person, I have a chronic illness. I am dependent on using escalators and elevators because a huge amount of stairs could actually make me sick. Okay, I walk with a cane. So you know, disabled folks are very dependent on electricity, right? And so we need affordability and we need access. That's a lot of what I advocate for, is that it's not just about the ownership and it's not just about electric vehicles. It's how all people can benefit from the work, from using the energy, and making that conscious decision about where it comes from and what kind it is, right? We don't want to continue producing energy that harms other people in other places, right? Just the same way it has harmed me where I grew up. We're trying to change that system and create a just transition. So that is what we focus on.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for both your work and for being here. It means so much. We are pushing, getting ready to run out of time, so I would have to say our goodbyes right now. We want to thank both Kat and Jessica for coming out, or for taking your time to speaking with us and speaking with our panelists. We also like to thank our earlier panelists, Dr. Logan Hennessy and Dr. Daria Silenciano, for stopping by. We're going to head back and let Chelsea take it away. Thank you, guys.
Right on. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dre, and thank you so much for your panel moderating. Once again, we are back at the Climate Poll HQ to hear from you, our wonderful audience at home. The final poll link should now be available in the chat below, so please click and get to answering because, of course, once again, the time on the clock is 60 seconds. While we wait for our results, I would like to once again thank our incredible guest speakers for this last portion of the panel, Cad Smith and Jessica Guadalupe Tovar, for sharing their experiences fighting against environmental injustice. We SFSU students and staff alike are humbled, inspired, and so lucky to get to hear about the vital work that you two do in the Bay Area. And while we wait for the poll results, I think I'd like to share a couple more fun facts about them. Cad Smith, of course, worked on the first soda tax campaign in the country in Berkeley in 2014, where he made the connection between health, climate justice, and policy. And Jessica Guadalupe Tovar is currently a Roddenberry Fellow and organizes, of course, for, in her own words, clean power to the people. All right, hopefully our results are in. There's 5 seconds remaining, everybody. Thank you to everyone who has participated, and even if you've just been watching, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming out to support us students. Now, I think we're ready for the final quiz segment.
That concludes the first installment of Climate Watch. We are the change. Thank you once again to Daria, Logan, Cad, and Jessica, and to all of our viewers for joining us this evening. From all of us here at Climate HQ, please stay safe and have a great weekend. I'm Macy. Good night.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Becca 502. My name is Erica Pulley, and I am a lecturer in the Becca department here at SF State. I have taught our department's environmental communication course, also known as Becca 502, for the last several years. Never could I have imagined teaching this course, or any course for that matter, during fire and smoke disasters and online during a global pandemic, all of which have directly impacted my students' health, housing, income, and well-being in so many myriad ways. As I say this, we are here in the Western U.S. facing severe drought and entering fire season way too early. Despite all of these hardships, somehow my Becca 502 students this semester have taken a simple assignment to host an online panel discussion and transformed it into something totally innovative. This has truly been a student-led, student-produced project. As I've reminded them all semester, this process has been an experiment with many ups and downs, but has been an incredible thing to witness as an educator and climate evangelist. Here today, they are engaged in real-world application of environmental communication techniques and concepts. I hope you as the audience have learned and been inspired today, too. While I have this moment, I would like to take the opportunity to thank several people whose support have made this event possible. Firstly, Dr. Laura Burris, chair of the biology department, who spearheaded the Climate Change Certificate program and allowed my class to create this event and help get the word out about the new certificate. Dr. Sammy Reist, who has allowed me to teach the course she created many years ago while she serves her duties as chair of the Becca department. Professor Logan Hennessy, who has been a great resource for my students throughout the semester. The entire Environmental Studies department, which continues to push environmental and climate dialogue forward across disciplines. And of course, our awesome guests today, who have freely shared their time, knowledge, and resources. Thank you again. But most of all, thank you to the Spring 2021 Becca 502 cohort, who, representing departments from all over campus, Becca to cinema, to computer science, to psychology, art, English and rhetoric, communication studies, visual communications, business and marketing, statistics, journalism and environmental studies. They have brought their own unique perspectives, knowledge, and personal experiences and worked together under incredible circumstances, dedicated countless hours to producing this multimedia event, engaged in thoughtful classroom dialogue, and who I hope will leave this semester even more committed to deepening their understanding of the roots of environmental injustices and how to communicate for and about a better shared future. And especially congrats to all of our graduating seniors. I will miss you all. Yay!